While browsing through Craigslist in search of odd jobs, I stumbled upon dog walking opportunities available in my local area, Jacksonville. Certain parts of the area were quite rural, and it seemed that many people were reluctant to take their dogs for walks. It's ironic, considering the popularity of the Dog Whisperer show back in the early 2000s, where people learned about the importance of dog walking for their pets' well-being. One particular ad caught my attention. They were looking for someone to handle morning and evening dog walks. The job was located on a farm, and the owners explained that they were unable to walk their dogs due to certain circumstances, though I can't recall the exact details. Regardless, they wanted their dogs to be walked twice a day, every day. This was by far the most lucrative opportunity listed in the dog walking section of Craigslist. Securing this gig would mean earning thousands of dollars per month. Clearly, these people had enough disposable income to invest in their dog's exercise routine. Since they could afford it, and I desired the financial benefits, I decided to apply. The ad instructed me to contact a person named Patrick, whose mobile number was provided. I made the call, but no one answered, so I sent a text message instead. Days went by, and I anxiously awaited a response. Finally, I received a message from Patrick. He mentioned that he had been inundated with applications, and his phone was constantly ringing. I believed him, considering the attractive compensation offered for walking the dogs twice a day, morning and evening. While Patrick hadn't provided specifics about the duration of the walks or the number of dogs involved, it was understandable why so many people were interested. Patrick informed me that he wanted potential dog walkers to visit the farm and meet the dogs. This meeting would help assess how the dogs would respond to different individuals. I agreed to meet him on the farm 2 days later, on Saturday. The opportunity seemed promising, offering substantial income for what essentially amounted to a considerable amount of dog walking. The farm was located approximately 20 minutes away from my residence in Jacksonville. After receiving the address from Patrick, I made my way there. Upon arrival, I was greeted by a desolate sight, vast empty fields stretching as far as the eye could see. The farm was surrounded by a massive tree line, almost as if it bordered a forest or a national park. I proceeded down the lengthy lane, following the specific instructions provided by Patrick. He had informed me that the wooden gate would be left open, and I should drive through it for a few minutes before taking the second left past an old horse barn. Following the instructions, I found myself in the heart of the farm. 2 large houses stood in the center, accompanied by a few outbuildings. Observing where all the cars were parked, I selected a spot next to one of them to park mine. Uncertain whether I would be meeting the dogs alongside other applicants or if we had individual time slots to meet the family, I remained unfazed. Confidence was my ally, and it didn't pose any concerns for me. Heading towards the house, I knocked on the front door. Almost instantly, Patrick opened it, and I could hear a small dog barking from behind him. It turned out to be Betsy, an 8-year-old female spaniel, a middle-aged member of the breed. Patrick, a wonderful gentleman, stood before me. His family, kind and affectionate, included 3 sons and 1 daughter, ranging in age from 10 to 15 years old. Although initially a bit shy, they were instructed to line up and extend their hands for a handshake, cordially greeting me. Patrick guided me to the kitchen table, where I took a seat next to his wife. They proceeded to ask me a few questions about my experience, such as whether I had owned dogs in the past and what dog walking endeavors I had undertaken. Additionally, they requested my complete information for a criminal records check. The entire meeting went exceptionally well, leaving me with a positive impression of both the family and the opportunity at hand. The family was genuinely kind and treated me well during the meeting. Most importantly, Betsy, the lively spaniel, instantly took a liking to me. Throughout our interaction, she couldn't contain her excitement, continuously jumping up and attempting to shower me with affectionate licks. At one point, we had to keep her out of the kitchen as she persistently tried to leap onto my lap while we were conducting the meeting. It was a mix of cuteness and humor. When I left their house, I felt invigorated and happy. I had a strong sense of confidence that I would be chosen for the job, given my extensive background in caring for dogs. I had been dog sitting for neighbors practically my entire life, and our family had owned German Shepherds since I was just 4 years old. We had raised them from puppies to the wonderful dogs they are today. Patrick, a pleasant individual, accompanied me as I left the house, providing guidance and displaying a positive demeanor. I genuinely believed that I had successfully secured the job. True to my expectations, a couple of days later, I received a text from Patrick's number requesting a phone call. Without delay, I called him, and as anticipated, I had indeed been chosen for the position. Patrick explained that he selected me among all the applicants because he believed I possessed the most experience, and Betsy responded exceptionally well to me. He asked me to start in 2 weeks' time, allowing the family to finalize some other matters. An interesting detail I learned was that Betsy had been rescued at 4 years old, originating from an abusive environment. Consequently, they had encountered difficulties in training her, which explained their need for a dog walker to keep her leashed and ensure she received exercise through regular walks. 2 weeks passed, and I returned to the farm, following the instructions once again, this time turning left at the horse barn. The location was vast, but Patrick had provided clear instructions for walking Betsy. He directed me to a designated path on the outer left-hand side of the farm, a 2-mile dirt path that was deemed ideal for walking her. Most of the surrounding fields and land were uneven, overgrown, and potentially hazardous to walk on. I certainly didn't want to risk injuring my ankles or feet by stepping into any of the holes or ditches scattered around. Hence, the designated path was a wise choice. To reach the path, I had to transport Betsy in the back of my car. Patrick had provided a small crate to keep her in, as she tended to get restless and bark excessively during car rides. The first walk went smoothly, and I repeated the same route later that evening. Patrick gave me some treats to reward Betsy during our walks, and everything seemed to be going well. However, as the weeks went by and winter approached, the evening walks became more challenging. The nights grew darker, and I started facing a dilemma. I wasn't sure if I should address the issue of having to walk Betsy in the dark. The overgrown path, flanked by a forest on either side, was barely 3 or 4 feet wide. The thought of walking around 6 or 7 p.m. during winter when it was pitch black terrified me. However, the job was at stake, and declining to walk her in the dark might cost me my position. Thus, I decided to start bringing a flashlight along. The initial times when nightfall arrived swiftly were nerve-wracking, I must admit. Betsy, on the other hand, didn't seem to mind. She enjoyed the walks regardless. I kept her on a leash at all times, and was provided treats by Patrick to reward her for proper toileting and good behavior during the walks. Everything continued to progress smoothly until about 6 months into the job. By this point, I had established a strong bond and friendship with Patrick's entire family. Betsy had reached the age of 9, and her responses to me and behavior during our walks had matured. However, one evening walk marked a significant turning point that would forever change everything. As usual, I prepared for the walk by picking up Betsy, grabbing my flashlight, and collecting treats from Patrick's kitchen counter. I placed her in the crate and drove down to the path. Upon releasing her, everything seemed normal. I switched on the flashlight and commenced our walk along the familiar path. At this time in Jacksonville, we hadn't experienced much snow. Instead, there had been sleet and abundant rainfall, rendering the path somewhat wet and churned up in certain areas. Nevertheless, this didn't pose a problem. We followed our usual route of walking a mile out and back. However, when we reached the halfway point, near a distinctive tree where we typically turned around, I noticed some noises emanating from the right side of the path. The sounds resembled rustling in the hedges, possibly a deer or another animal. Initially, I didn't pay much attention and only glanced briefly in that direction without shining my flashlight towards the source. Hearing noises in the forest was not uncommon, and I dismissed it as such. The noise initially caught my attention due to its volume, and Betsy came to a sudden halt, fixating her gaze on the sound's origin. We decided to turn around and head back toward the car. Usually, the walk would take around 20 minutes or 15 minutes if we walked at a brisk pace, but this particular evening was faster. With winter approaching, I still didn't feel completely at ease in the darkness with only a flashlight. As we disregarded the noise and continued our walk, Betsy shook off any uneasiness and resumed her cheerful stride ahead of me. I dismissed the noise, attributing it to a distant deer or some other harmless creature. However, the same sound resurfaced, a loud snapping of a twig that instantly caught my attention. It was a distinct noise, one that I recognized as the unmistakable sound of a human foot stepping on a twig. The echo reverberated through the surrounding forest. I froze in my tracks, and so did Betsy. This time, I directed the beam of my flashlight towards the forest's edge, only to be confronted with a nightmarish sight. Standing approximately 50 feet away from me were 3 men, or at least they appeared to be men, cloaked in black robes with their hoods raised. The powerful beam from my flashlight illuminated their figures, but their faces remained obscured by the hoods. From their jawlines, it was evident that they were indeed men, with 2 of them sporting beards and one having light stubble. A surge of uncontrollable fear gripped me as Betsy sensed something amiss and moved closer to them. In that split second, one of the cloaked figures started walking toward me, closing the distance. I have never experienced such intense fear in my entire life, a feeling of impending doom. It became a race against time to reach the safety of my car before they could reach me. Without hesitation, I turned and tugged Betsy's leash, propelling myself into a full sprint. I tightly gripped the flashlight in my right hand, desperately trying to maintain balance on the muddy path. Glancing behind me, I saw the 3 cloaked individuals giving chase. They had already made it onto the path and were closing in rapidly. Tears streamed down my face as panic overwhelmed me. I ran for my life, exerting every ounce of strength, while desperately dragging Betsy alongside me. She seemed oblivious to the danger, more curious about the men's presence. It was a painful blend of panic and anguish, all amalgamated into a single terrifying ordeal. Overwhelmed by a sense of imminent tragedy, I saw my life flash before my eyes, convinced that this muddy path would be the end of it all. Lost in my thoughts, I was abruptly jolted back to reality as my foot landed on a pile of slippery mud, causing me to lose balance and fall backward. A pained groan escaped my lips as Betsy rushed over, showering me with comforting licks on my face. Regaining my composure, I quickly got back on my feet and resumed running. However, to my horror, I realized that I no longer had Betsy's leash in my hand. She was trailing behind me, and the menacing figures were gaining ground. In that moment, it was not a conscious decision, but instinct took over, propelling me forward with the singular goal of saving my own life. I continued to flee for my survival, knowing that if I turned back for Betsy, I would be captured. Sprinting with every ounce of strength remaining in my body, I glanced behind me and saw the 3 men retrieve Betsy's leash. They paused momentarily before veering off the path, disappearing into the forest with her. I pushed myself to the limit, still having a few minutes of running ahead of me until reaching the safety of my car. One of the men persistently pursued me, while the others diverted their attention to Betsy. Finally, I reached my car and sped back to the farmyard. In a state of sheer distress, I pounded on the door, and Patrick answered, finding me collapsed in a pitiful heap on my knees. Through tears and sobs, I recounted the harrowing ordeal, providing him with precise details of where it had occurred, on his own land. Filled with fury, he armed himself with a shotgun and a semi-automatic, climbing into the truck with me. He promptly contacted the police and his brothers, who arrived within minutes. I wept incessantly for what felt like an eternity that evening. Our search efforts yielded no sign of Betsy. All we discovered were the footprints left behind by the cloaked men. Despite the investigators' dedicated search, Their resources and time were limited, given that the victim was not human. Betsy had been abducted by these cloaked individuals, but it was clear that their primary target had been me. Since that fateful incident, I have ceased walking dogs, and even sharing this story brings tears to my eyes. Deep down, I regret releasing Betsy, but had I not done so, I doubt I would be here today, recounting this terrifying tale. Turned 18. She had a lot of anxiety about learning to drive, but after numerous lessons and many stressful weekends and evenings, she improved significantly. She became proficient enough to pass her driving test and confident enough to navigate the roads without my constant guidance and warnings. Eventually, she moved away to attend university and planned to buy her own car upon arrival. The campus was located about 20 or 30 miles from our home, which may not seem far for other students, but it was too distant for her to commute daily. Instead, she intended to return home once a week. Considering this, I decided to sell her car. Craigslist seemed like the best option, as the car, a 2010 Citroën, was not commonly found in America, where we resided. Citroëns tend to be more prevalent in Europe, particularly in the UK. I originally purchased the car for around $2,000, so I listed it for $1,000 on the platform. It didn't bother me much to sell it at a lower price. Soon enough, I received inquiries from interested buyers who wanted to inspect the car in person. While I'd always been somewhat skeptical about having strangers come to the house, I had no other viable means of getting rid of it, unless I settled for a measly $10 from a local dealer or franchise. Afterward, I decided it would be best to give my daughter the money from the car sale, which she could put towards her planned purchase of another car. Although I had initially bought the car for her, I wanted her to have that money to contribute to her next vehicle. I then came across a man named Paul on Craigslist who showed interest in buying the car. Paul explained that his daughter, who was around 16 or 17 years old, was learning to drive and specifically wanted a basic car with a manual transmission. Many people these days prefer automatics, but Paul emphasized the importance of his daughter learning to drive stick shift. As we continued conversing over the next few days, Paul asked various questions about the car's service history, maintenance, and previous work done on it. He seemed extremely knowledgeable about cars, with a deep understanding of mechanics and how they should operate. On the other hand, I had never been particularly interested in that aspect and usually relied on mechanics and garage visits for maintenance, even though I kept up with regular servicing. Paul, however, was a true car enthusiast, and he asked me questions that went over my head. I found myself Googling some of the terms and phrases he used just to understand what he was asking. It became a bit overwhelming, and I eventually invited him to come and inspect the car in person. Finally, on a Friday night after Paul finished work, he arrived with his daughter to evaluate the vehicle. I was eager to get rid of the car at this point, as it had become an additional inconvenience in our already crowded driveway. With 4 cars for our household of 4 or sometimes 5 people, we constantly had to rearrange and shuffle them around. But that's a separate story I'll address later. Finally, the prospective buyer arrived, and my wife was eager for me to sell the car and retrieve the cash to give to our daughter. He meticulously examined the car, immediately requesting to inspect the engine under the hood. As he poked around and shone a flashlight on various engine components, he seemed intensely focused. Standing next to his daughter, both of us with crossed arms, we had no clue what was happening. We felt quite clueless as this self-proclaimed expert scrutinized every detail of the vehicle, treating it as if it were a $1 million Formula One car. I had no intention of selling him a faulty or scam vehicle, despite the fact that I had listed it for just over $1,000, which was likely a fraction of its actual worth. However, he remained suspicious, casting doubt on the car. After spending 3 or 4 minutes inspecting the engine, he turned to me and suggested taking the car for a test drive. He wanted to evaluate its performance, with me in the passenger seat, him driving, and his daughter in the back. Finding it somewhat intriguing, I agreed. We both fastened our seatbelts and embarked on the drive. It was during this moment that things took an interesting turn, and I began to question the buyer's true intentions with the car. The buyer proceeded to accelerate the car aggressively and abruptly slam on the brakes in the middle of the road. Despite being in a quiet neighborhood with no other vehicles around, I couldn't comprehend why he was behaving this way. I had provided him with a comprehensive maintenance history, explained the reasons behind our purchase, and even mentioned the use of premium gas and regular servicing. I assumed all of that information would be sufficient. However, he seemed to be testing the car as if he were a professional race driver, as if he intended to race it on tracks. Choosing to ignore his peculiar behavior, we sat there awkwardly as he continued to slam the brakes, pump the accelerator, and occasionally stall the car. The gearbox produced unpleasant noises, indicating gear shifting issues, and it felt as if he was close to causing damage. Looking over at him, I attempted to break the silence and awkwardness by asking, "So, what do you think?" Throughout the entire ordeal, his daughter remained silent, as if he held complete authority, and she had no say in the matter. He turned towards me and asked further questions about the car as we pulled over to the side near the sidewalk. He allowed the engine to idle with the clutch engaged. Puzzled, I felt compelled to inquire about his extensive testing, questioning the purpose behind these trials. He claimed it was to ensure the car's reliability and identify any potential issues. Just when he seemed almost convinced that this was the right car for him, we prepared to turn around and head back to my house for the final transaction. Unexpectedly, the car suddenly stalled, plunging us into an awkward, deafening silence. He remained silent for a couple of seconds, his gaze fixated on the steering wheel. Eventually, he broke the silence with a hesitant sound, and then turned to look at me. I returned his gaze, utterly unsure of what was transpiring, but deeply aware of the uncomfortable atmosphere that had settled upon us. At that moment, he attempted to start the car again, but it refused to start. Growing increasingly frustrated, he turned to me and questioned what was happening, implying that I had deliberately set him up and was attempting to scam him. Despite his continuous efforts, the car remained unresponsive. Interestingly, the battery warning light appeared, indicating a low battery. Instead of acknowledging the warning, he directed his frustration towards me, accusing me of deceitfully trying to swindle him out of $1,000 with a faulty car. It was perplexing to me that he could attribute the car's issues to my alleged deception, especially considering his own actions just moments earlier. He had been vigorously pushing the car's limits, forcefully accelerating and abruptly braking, even though we had barely left my driveway after a cold start. I was genuinely confused by the sudden shift in his demeanor. He had transformed from an inquisitive and somewhat nerdy investigator, meticulously examining every aspect of the engine, to someone irrationally convinced that I had ulterior motives. I assured him of my honesty, expressing that I had no knowledge of the underlying issue causing the car to stall. However, he continued to berate me, shutting me out and instructing his daughter to exit the car. I vividly remember them storming back to their truck, marching together, with him firmly holding her hand. I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, as if I had inadvertently become the perpetrator of a scam in his eyes. After the incident, I decided to take the car to my local dealership to have it examined. They quickly determined that it was simply a battery issue. Surprisingly, they mentioned that the battery charge was still at a satisfactory 75%, so there was no need for a replacement. It became clear to me that the guy had recklessly pushed the car to its limits without considering the consequences. It was an old car, and his actions demonstrated his lack of knowledge. No experienced individual in mechanics or engineering would subject a car to such intense stress right after starting it up. I relisted the car on Craigslist and eventually found a suitable buyer. It turned out to be an elderly lady in her mid-60s who needed a reliable vehicle for her daily errands. She thoroughly inspected the car, and everything was in proper working order. The battery warning light had vanished, and to ensure the engine hadn't suffered any damage from the previous incident, I took it for a few additional test drives. Satisfied with its performance, I sold the car to the lady. I gave the extra $1,000 to my daughter, which she used to purchase another car. Looking back, that encounter with the guy was undoubtedly my worst and only negative experience on Craigslist. I was a 19-year-old male looking for a roommate after my ex moved out. I posted an ad on Craigslist and received a reply the next day. Desperate to make rent, I invited the guy and his dad to check out the house. They liked my Star Wars action figure collection, and the dad agreed to pay the rent for his son, Rick, who was 25 and going to college. I thought it was great because I wouldn't have to worry about Rick missing rent. I sent them a sublet contract to sign. About a week later, Rick moved in with his bed and dresser, and his dad made the first rent payment on time. Everything seemed fine initially, but things started getting weirder over the next few months. In the second month, the dad was late with the rent and claimed I didn't inform him about the deadline, even though it was clearly stated in the contract. I ended up paying from my own pocket. Rick began complimenting my appearance daily, but quickly added that he wasn't gay. He had a girlfriend living far away. One day, I caught him staring at me while I was taking a shower, and when I asked him about it, he claimed he mistook me for someone else. This was really odd. In the third month, the rent was late again, and the dad once again said he didn't know about the deadline, even though we had already faced the same issue the previous month. I confronted him about last month's late rent, but he ignored me and didn't reply. He seemed annoyed and started ignoring me for the second time. Once again, I had to cover the rent myself. Eventually, he paid me 5 days late. I warned him that if the rent was late for the third time, we would discuss Rick moving out. Rick got a job at a nearby pizza place, but it seemed like he wasn't attending any of his classes. His truck was always filled with various old coffee makers, and he was into parkour. I noticed shoe marks on the walls in the living room and hallway. He mentioned dressing as Harley Quinn for Comic-Con, repeatedly emphasizing that he wasn't gay. While I had no issue with his sexuality, his behavior towards me felt creepy and uncomfortable. He would engage in strange and unsettling actions daily. We started having arguments about small things like chores, as he neglected tasks such as dishes and sweeping. I discovered that he had been playing with my Star Wars items in his room, which, while we shared a geeky interest, bothered me. He had a brief visit from his girlfriend and her dog, but when she left, she decided to leave the dog with Rick without asking me. The bathroom was covered in pubic hair, including on my own clippers, which he used without permission. In the fourth month, predictably, his dad was late with the rent once again. I told Rick that I needed him to move out. This was the final straw, and I had reached my limit. Instead of agreeing to go out one last time, I officially kicked Rick out. Both Rick and his father decided that they would take me to court. Rick had developed a habit of using my PlayStation and TV more than I did. Out of frustration, I put a child lock on them. When Rick found out, he wanted to physically fight me because I refused to let him use my PlayStation. While I was tempted, given the significant height and strength difference, with me being 6'3" and him being around 5'4", I recognized that it was my house, and I had the legal right to protect myself and my property. It was the entitlement of Rick's behavior that bothered me. His father was paying the rent, and I sensed that his dad had done everything for him his whole life. Although my parents had also supported me, there came a point where I had to take responsibility for myself, doing my own laundry, cooking, and eventually moving out. Rick, on the other hand, still acted like a child and expected me to cater to his needs and allow him to use my belongings without question. A few days later, I stumbled upon a letter from Rick's probation officer on the coffee table. This revelation surprised me, so I decided to pay $3 for a background check. It turned out that Rick had prior convictions for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. I immediately called his father and explained the situation, telling him that I needed Rick to leave. The next day, I grew concerned because I knew what kind of person I was dealing with. When I conveyed my request to his dad, He laughed at me over the phone, insisting that I take them to court once again. This time, I laughed back, feeling a surge of courage, and informed him that I had Rick's probation officer's phone number. If he attempted to fight me on any other day, I could simply call her. When I returned home from work that day, Rick was gone along with all his belongings. He left the amount he owed me for rent that month on the table, but he did steal a pair of vice grips I had left on the kitchen counter. Lesson learned: never find a roommate on Craigslist.